Hi, this is Mrs. Kidman, and in this video, we're going to be talking about how you can write trig equations given a graph. Now, these are going to be very basic ones. There's not going to be any horizontal shifts that we're looking at. We're just going to be dealing with shifts or writing these equations even without vertical shifts. However, you can use the same idea to find that vertical shift if your midline is in a different place. So rather than looking at the first few questions, we're actually going to jump down to questions number 5, 6, and 7 to go over this. So looking at question number 5, in order to find the equations of this, we've kind of got a couple of steps. First, what we want to do is we want to decide, do I have a sine graph or do I have a cosine graph? The easiest way to decide this is to look at the y-axis. So that's going to be this line here. If it crosses at the top of the curve, we're going to have a cosine, right? The top. It can also be at the bottom if it's reflected, but we're not going to be dealing with any of those. A sine graph is always going to cross in the middle along our y-axis there. So in this case, looking at our problem, we have a cosine graph. After we've decided that, the second thing that we need to identify is we need to figure out what the period is. And we need to use the period to figure out what B is. Now, B is defined as the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi, right? So between 0 and 2 pi, how many times do we see our pattern? Now, sometimes that's really easy to count. Sometimes it isn't. But there's actually a formula we can use to calculate it. It's going to be 2 pi divided by however long the period is. And we're going to use that to write our equation. Now, after you've identified B, the third things you need to do is figure out your amplitude, which is the distance from the midline to the top, and figure out your midline. Right? That's going to be right in the middle. So exactly where our function starts to repeat itself. So a lot of the times you can find it at 0. It could be at any number though. It's going to be right in the middle of our function. Now, after we've done that, the fourth step that we need to do is we need to actually write our equation. So as we go to write our equation here, what we want to look for is identifying all of our pieces. So sine and cosine are going to be the same. So A times sine of bx plus c, or you can have a cosine. So A times cosine of bx plus c. Now, A's are going to mean the same thing. So both of these A's refer to our, I'm going to write up here. A is the same thing as our amplitude. So we're just going to write our amplitude in there, right? Whatever that is. So these two are the same thing. They are the amplitude. When it comes to B, that's what we're going to calculate in that step 2. But B is the same thing as 2 pi divided by the period. So we want to be able to find that. The last piece that we need to fill in is C, and C is actually going to be our midline. So if we're able to find all 3 of these pieces of information, we can write the equation of the graph. So let's take a look at our first example here, this number 5. This one is going to be a sine or a cosine graph. Well, it's going to be a cosine graph because it crosses at the top. So we know that we're going to have a y equals something cosine of something x plus or minus something, right? So now let's go ahead and fill in the pieces. Period is how long the pattern lasts. So we want to look from like the top to the top. So how long does that pattern look like it lasts? It looks like it lasts 2 pi. So I'm going to switch colors here, but we are going across 2 pi. Perfect. So then after we find our period, we want to figure out what B is. So I'm going to just do 2 pi divided by the period, which is 2 pi. So B is going to be 1, right? This right here is B. Next, we want to find our amplitude. So amplitude is the distance from the midline to the top. So sometimes finding that's tricky without knowing where your midline is. So let's find our midline. Our midline is going to be exactly in the middle. So you can kind of see the distance from here to here, and you want to split in half. So on our graph here, it looks like our midline is going to be at 0. So if our midline is at 0 and this is our top, how far above that is it going to be? Well, it looks like it's 3. So let's go ahead and fill in our equation here. So y equals, our first number is our midline, or our amplitude, sorry. Our first number is the amplitude, so it's going to be 3. Our cosine of what goes next to our x is going to be that b value. So our period, our 2 pi divided by the period. So in our case, it's going to be 1 plus our midline, which is 0. Okay, so that's how we'll write those. Let's take a look at this next problem and do that same thing. So looking at this first, do I have sine or do I have cosine? Well, it crosses the y-axis in the middle of the curve, right? So do you see how the bottom is here and the top is here and we're crossing in the middle? So because it crosses in the middle of our curve, we know that we're going to have a sine. So y equals something times sine of something times x plus our midline, whatever that's going to be. So now let's go through and find these things. So we want to figure out what the period is. So when you look at this, you can calculate period by going top to top, bottom to bottom, or you can go middle to middle, as long as it goes both down and up in that distance. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to go from about negative 2 pi to about 2 pi. So how far is that going to be? Well, that looks like we've got 2 pi here and 2 pi here, which makes a period of 4 pi. So if we want to figure out what b is, we're just going to take 2 pi divided by 4 pi, which equals 1/2, right? And that seems to make sense, right? Because remember that b means how many times we see the pattern between 0 and 2 pi. And from 0 to 2 pi here, we only see half the pattern. Our amplitude is going to be the distance from the middle to the top, or from the midline to the top, or the midline to the bottom. So let's skip that and find our midline. Our midline is going to be right in the middle of our graph. So again, looking at our function here, the midline looks like it is right at 0. So how far is it from that midline up to the top? Now you don't have to be perfect. You can just approximate. So to me, it looks like it's about 1.5, right? So you say 3/2, you can say 1.5, doesn't matter, but that's roughly where we're at. So then we can come in here and fill in our numbers. So our amplitude goes between our y equals and our sine. So we're gonna get 1.5 times sine of b. So I'm not gonna write 4 pi, but I'm gonna write 1/2 plus our midline at 0. Okay, let's take a look at one last problem here. So first we want to decide, is it sine or cosine? Well, this one crosses in the middle. So we are going to have a sine function, sine of something times x plus our midline. Okay, next we want to figure out what our period is. Now this one's hard to count, right? Because it's going from here to here. So we think 2, but how are these blocks being counted? Well, 3 blocks gives us pi and 6 blocks gives us 2 pi. So that means every block is 1/3 of pi. So if we get 1/3 pi here, our second block is going to be 2 pi over 3, or 2/3 pi. So that means that our period is going to be 2 pi over 3. So then we want to divide that. So we get 2 pi divided by 2 pi over 3. Now that number is kind of awkward for us to do in our heads, but it can totally be done. So rather than doing it in our heads, you can totally use your calculator. If you type this into your calculator, you're going to want to type it in as 2 pi in parentheses divided by parentheses 2 pi divide 3, right? Something like this. And you're going to end up finding out that our b value, which is that 2 pi divided by our period, is just going to be 3. And that makes sense, right? Because here's 2 pi, here's 0. How many times do we see our pattern? Well, we see it. Let me switch colors so that you guys can all see what we're talking about here. We see it once, we see it twice, we see it 3 times, right? So that makes sense that our how many times we see it is going to be 3. So then let's look at our midline. So our midline goes right down the middle of our function. Where is that going to be in this case? Our midline is at 0. Our amplitude is the distance from the midline to the top, or the midline to the bottom. In this case, if we go from 0 up to here, it's just going to be a little 1/2. So we can then fill in our answer here by saying y equals our amplitude, so 1/2 sine, times our b value, which is how many times we see it between 0 and 2 pi, which we found out to be 3, plus our midline. So that's how you can write the equation of those. They can get more complicated, but we won't see anything more complicated than that in our class. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. But otherwise, keep on practicing your writing of those trig functions.